So exactly how does the raw food diet work? As I understand, you're promoting the raw food diet.
So there are a number of diets on the market. When you want to start and change your nutrition, some people become vegetarians, others are vegan, others are macrobiotic or start with a Paleolithic diet.
Hmm.
So there's thousands of different diets, and they're sometimes very different from each other. For example, some diets are entirely on raw foods. Other diets are entirely on cooked foods. Some diets include dairy products, some don't. Some include meat, some don't. And so there's lots of these different diets, and it's very difficult for a person who's not with sufficient training and who just discovers these areas to get a correct view of what is the best choice. Now, my approach is a global approach from several points of view. And it seems to me that the question of the denaturation of food, which means transforming the food, has been overlooked until now. Now, there are different ways you can transform the foods. You can transform them by heating them. It's what you call cooking when it's related to nutrition. Now, by cooking the food, it's not just a small transformation, it's a major transformation. If you look, for example, at a raw apple, you cook it, and it becomes cooked apple, a compote de pomme, we would say in France. Now, you can see that the softness of the apple, the sense, when you touch it, it's not the same. The color changes when it gets cooked. And the taste, when you eat it, changes quite a bit. Now, these macroscopic changes, which we can taste with our own senses, which we can perceive, are just the outside view that the chemical composition of the food has totally changed just by heating it. So the cooking of the food is not a minor transformation. It's a major transformation of the molecules, the substances that are inside the food itself. And so this question of cooking the food has been overlooked until now because everybody cooks his food and thinks it's the right way to do things. But there's a number of questions that can be asked. And if it's not better to eat raw foods and not cook the foods as we do usually.
Well, why are
The,
cooked foods bad for you?
well, because they're quite transformed, and it seems that our genetic hasn't changed for quite a bit of time. And this goes back to our ancestors and the ancestors of our ancestors very long time ago. When you compare today the genetics of a human being and a chimpanzee, you will see that there's over 99% of the DNA, which is exactly identical between a human and a chimpanzee. And the digestion process is done by using enzymes which are coded in our DNA. So the fact that our DNA hasn't changed for millions and millions of years, and that cooking is a very recent innovation in the human history, it's estimated that the spread of cooking upon humans was about 10,000 years ago at the time of the Neolithic period. Now that's a fairly recent innovation. Of course, the oldest traces of fire used for cooking are much older than that, but it was not used as a regular cooking transformation process. The main change was about 10 to 15,000 years ago when it started being really widespread. And that's when you start to see a number of diseases spreading as well in our human ancestors. And so the question can be asked today if we're right or wrong to cook our food the ways we do. So what I suggest is to cast a new look on the way we transform our foods, and especially on cooking and on the introduction of specific foods such as bread, flour, farine in French, and the regular use of cooking especially, which is a huge transformation. And when you look at what happens on different types of animals or on humans when you switch from a raw food to a cooked food, or from the other way around, from the cooked diet back to a raw diet, you can see very interesting observations, and I've been doing that for a number of years.
Cooked food tastes really good. Isn't that
Yeah.
your body's way of telling you that this is something you need?
Well, you're right. Cooked food is really tasty. That's the reason people are so addicted on cooked food. It's so tasty. In fact, it's so pleasant that it really becomes addictive, like cigarette smoking. So when you start, it's rather difficult to stop. But that doesn't mean that it's good for you. In fact, I think we should distinguish between two types of foods. Foods which were available in nature and foods which are not available in nature. So let's call them natural foods and artificial foods. Natural foods which humans have been in contact with for millions of years, there's been a sort of natural process which has been developed, which is pleasure, which helps us to choose the correct food, the adequate foods which we need for our health. So this is an innate system, a sort of human dietary instinct, which helps us choose the right foods for our health. The way it works is very simple. When you need a food, it's tasty. When you don't need it, it's repulsive or it doesn't have any taste. This works quite well on the natural foods, which means the food in the state where you can find them in nature, let's say a raw apple or raw fish or shellfish. But what happens when you transform the foods, like let's take a modern recipe like pasta. Now you will grind the grain, it will be oxidized. Then you put it and cook it into water, then new chemical reactions appear. Then you put salt on top, and you end up with a product that is quite tasty. It can be noodles, it can be pizza. You can have many thousands of these modern recipes. But these are foods that did not exist in nature. Therefore, our innate system to relying on taste has not programmed these new tastes and does not give us an indication whether we need it or not. So the pleasure of eating is a reliable system when you apply it on natural foods, but it seems that you should not follow your pleasure when it's to apply it on cooked or transformed foods. In fact, this is quite similar to the case of smoking or other sorts of pleasure. If you look at the example of smoking, smoking is not a natural habit. It wasn't possible in nature a few million years ago. Mm-hmm. Today, people find it quite pleasant to smoke, but it still destroys your health, which shows quite clearly that it's not because something is pleasurable that you should absolutely do it. Sometimes things can be pleasurable and destruct your health, such as smoking. And it seems that eating cooked foods or transformed foods or even simply seasoned foods is one of these mistakes where you can get pleasure. And so a lot of people do it because, of course, we're programmed to go for pleasurable foods. That's how we're programmed in nature. So there's a sort of innate push that we want to eat whatever gives us a good taste. And it's normal because in nature, that's what we should be doing. But if we apply this to industrial foods, then we end up drinking a lot of Coca-Cola and eating a lot of pizzas. That's not good for our health.
You mentioned chimpanzee. Now, what if you gave a chimpanzee cooked food?
Well, he eats the cooked food. He loves it. Once he starts eating the cooked food, he cannot revert to the raw food anymore. It's very difficult, same as for humans. And he becomes sick like humans. In fact, chimpanzees are a very expensive animal which are used for medical tests. And what happens when you feed them with a typically human diet is that they become sick and in most cases they die. Now, because the chimpanzee is very expensive to buy, even the chimpanzees used for medical experiments in the laboratory are usually fed on bananas and raw foods. And then now the researchers that are doing these research should have come to the conclusion that it's interesting that the animal which is the closest to the human species simply dies if you put him on a cooked diet. But instead of coming to this interesting conclusion, they just came to the conclusion that to continue their experiments, they better feed them raw foods. And now it's interesting that, for example, for AIDS research, although the chimpanzee is the only animal that can get infected by the human AIDS virus, HIV, human immunodeficiency virus, it has been impossible to transmit the disease to the chimpanzee, although they The virus is transmitted, the virus gets multiplied and goes into every cell of the chimpanzee's body. The chimpanzees are never sick. They remain healthy carriers. And one of the explanations for this, which I propose, is that simply the chimpanzees are fed raw diets, even when they're used for medical experiments. And so it's quite interesting to see this, and that the question of how they are fed is not even taken into consideration by a standard scientist, when it's most interesting. In fact, this is not only for chimpanzees. It's quite a general situation that for many other viruses as well, there are often healthy carriers, which are those who are well fed, and the animals or humans which become sick and fall ill, which are those who don't have a correct type of nutrition and are fed industrial foods.
We feed our animals better than we feed our children.
You're right. And in fact, the industries who fabricate the food for animals are more careful than those who fabricate the foods for humans. When you go and ask the dog food fabricants, for example, about how they do the dog foods, they are very careful not to transform the food too much because they know that specific abnormal molecules appear at certain temperatures. So they're careful not to transform the pellets too much when you feed them to dogs or cats, because otherwise the pets will be ill. But when you sell food to humans in the supermarkets, there's so much of it is in those boxes and pellets, and the pellets, in fact, are not fabricated with the same precautions as those for the dogs and the cats. So we should open our minds and start to search this from a more scientific point of view. And the medical doctors and researchers should absolutely start putting more efforts in this direction, because the question of the transformation of the food is a major question which has not been explored properly until now.